It is a true honor to be here today. I'm Anna. I love math, and throughout my career, I have enjoyed building models and analytical solutions to describe different kinds of systems. In 2018, I saw a way that Google might use its flexible law to reduce its carbon footprint by connected optimization, analytical modeling techniques, grid carbon intensity data in its compute management infrastructure. Here with me today is Adrian Hilbers, a data scientist on the energy analytics team who made the carbon and energy impact assessment of our project rigorous and verifiable. The plan was to have our engineering lead, Alfredo Cern, with us, but he sprained his ankle on Friday, so he unfortunately could not join us. We are here on behalf of our colleagues, passionate and committed individuals at Google who made this project a reality. Next, we have an introductory video for some broader context to this work.
First, there was the planet, and then came people. And for thousands and thousands of years, they coexisted happily. The planet and everything in it worked together, which was good. But it wasn't quite good enough, because life was tough. Everything had to be done by hand, and it was hard work. So people invented technology and machines to help them. And the machines worked, and life became a little easier, which was good, but it wasn't quite good enough, because these machines used fossil fuels like coal and oil, and fossil fuels release lots of carbon into the atmosphere, and lots of carbon in the atmosphere is the main cause of climate change. So people looked for a different kind of energy, a clean energy, like that from the sun, the earth, the wind, and the sea. And the best part was, they didn't release any carbon into the atmosphere. So they called it carbon-free energy, which was good. But it wasn't quite good enough, because there are times and places when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow, which means sometimes there just isn't enough carbon-free energy available for everyone, everywhere. But that hasn't stopped people from trying to fix the carbon problem. They do the best they can with the tools they have. But what if they could use carbon-free energy all the time? Every hour of the day, every hour of the night, everywhere, with zero carbon released into the atmosphere. Some of the technology to do this at scale doesn't even exist yet. It would mean working with lots of different people, sharing lots of different ideas, inventing smart new ways to move, store, and generate carbon-free energy. The kind of inventing that gets people at Google very excited.
In 2018 and 19, when this effort, or one could call it now a movement, started, large compute providers such as Google, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft proved their climate commitment by investments into building renewable generation, wind and solar, to match their energy consumption across the world. At the same time, the power demand from data center computing was estimated to be around 1 to 1.5% of the total worldwide consumed electricity. It was expected to continue to grow, as we have witnessed to this date, when more than 5% of total electricity across the world is consumed by data centers. The world in 2018 and 19 was well aware of the negative impact of CO2 emissions on climate. Getting access to the carbon intensity data from the energy generation across the world was important for carbon accounting and general awareness. However, for some of us who worked in the area of power systems at the time and followed the trends in the computing industry, it was clear that for the effective power system decarbonization, more needs to be done. While doing the grid-related research, I discovered a startup called Electricity Maps that created a platform that provides real-time and forecasted carbon intensities. This figure shows us the carbon intensity of energy generation across different power grids of the world are quite different. If we zoom right in and look at the profiles of the energy generators within the same power grid, we observe that it can significantly vary within a single day. In this example, there is a large presence of carbon-free wind generators on the grid, supplying the large fraction of the energy demand during the night and early morning hours. I saw a clear opportunity for Google data centers to reduce its impact on climate, which arises from the following. First, Google data centers are located at different locations across the globe to be able to meet the demand of its customers in a reliable and timely manner. Second, the majority of consumed power comes from machines and workloads that run on them, and in any of our data centers, that would always be a time with some available compute resources. I also knew that there was a significant fraction of compute workloads that are flexible in when during the day they can run. Some examples include video processing workloads or large-scale machine learning training pipelines, and there are other examples of the so-called latency-tolerant jobs. We saw the opportunity in moving their runtimes to times of the day when there is more carbon-free generation on the grid, such as solar and wind. Moving load in time is like storing electricity in a battery, but you don't need a battery. On the other hand, there are computing services running on Google data centers that can be geographically rebalanced or resourced. For example, imagine your search request for YouTube video or other online applications that you use and that are not necessarily products of Google. These requests can be typically processed at different data centers locations. And other such examples include cases where cloud customers have a choice to choose a location for its purchased cloud resources, subject to their latency requirements. And we hope to see more of such examples. To summarize, there was an opportunity to shift flexible computing workloads in time and across locations to better align it with cleaner generation. And compute is special because it can be moved from one grid to another without using power transmission lines. So we embarked on our journey. To name this new research and development domain, in early stages of the project, we coined the term carbon-aware computing and defined it as an exploiting the flexibility in when, where, and how we do computing to effectively reduce carbon emissions. To accomplish this goal, we need to have grid carbon intensity data and a mechanism for shaping Google's data center load. And we also need to understand the flexibility of Google's and Google Cloud's workloads. Our main hypothesis was that data center with load flexibility can change their power load pattern on the electricity grid, and this can influence grid electricity generation and its carbon intensity. Internally, name Greener Google was spontaneously used to refer to our effort. Having the mission, we focused on finding out how to influence when and where we run our computing to reduce grid CO2 emissions. Well, carbon-aware computing at Google is now split into 4 pillars, which you can see on this slide. At the beginning, we were just a small, scrappy team of inspired individuals. We started Greener Google by designing the mechanism and infrastructure for load management. Only later, we started to work on increasing the compute flexibility. Our models enable more rigorous carbon accounting and reporting for both the internal and external cloud customers. And to scale the carbon-aware load shaping, we enabled other users and systems to make carbon-aware decisions by sharing carbon signals. And here is how we turned this carbon-aware vision into reality. What was the engineering needed to make it happen? Of course, we didn't start from scratch. We had multiple enablers. From the technological side, we have partners like Electricity Maps that provide forecasts for electricity grid carbon intensities. We also have the fantastic infrastructure Google has built over the last 3 decades. That gives us a lot of flexibility to move load around. We have a long history of doing global data-driven optimization for different purposes. From the modeling side, the sheer scale of Google operations was very helpful. You know, the aggregate computing demand over a course of the day can be accurately predicted. But of course, there were challenges too. For example, some jobs do not have flexibility in when to run, as they need to run all the time. This is the case of serving jobs. Like, I can do a Google search 24/7. Likewise, not all jobs can run anywhere, everywhere, for technical, legal, and policy reasons, and the solution for these challenges is quite straightforward and well understood. We just avoid this load. We can still have a big impact with the load we can shift. There were also less obvious challenges we had to tackle, which are more interesting. One is that we need to make sure that Google remains very reliable. This is fundamental to our business. This is relevant also to Greener Google because we cannot change system configuration production very often or globally. If we do so, there will eventually be a bug that is going to bring Google down. The other interesting challenge is that job scheduling is online, real-time process. We have billions of jobs being submitted every day. We don't have the luxury of batching them for hours and then running a massive optimization that takes, say, 10 minutes in order to schedule them. We need to schedule as we receive jobs. So in order to tackle these problems, we invented a technology called capacity curves. The key idea is that we reserve the right to tell the scheduler that the capacity available at a point in time is less than the actual capacity. This is very nice from an engineering viewpoint because we can completely decouple greener Google from the scheduler logic. We can run our analytics pipelines offline, create the capacity curves for the next day, and then push these to the scheduler for each cluster in a staged rollout. Note that when we refer to cluster, you can imagine a bunch of big metal boxes filled with the thousands of interconnected servers. One data center's building typically has an order of 10 such clusters. So here is an example. This was the situation some clusters before greener Google. There was some inflexible load, which we cannot touch. But on top of it, there was flexible load arriving at the high carbon intensity moment, in this case, in the middle of the day. As long as there was enough machine capacity in the cluster, the scheduler would run them immediately. That's what online schedulers do. They don't know the future. Now, when we push a capacity curve, the scheduler no longer can schedule the peak at the high carbon intensity moment. The load just doesn't fit, as the scheduler believes the capacity is less than the actual machine capacity at the moment. So the scheduler is forced to delay starting jobs until more capacity becomes available. This effectively pushes the load towards low carbon intensity times. Of course, for this to work, we still need to be able to run all jobs with their performance expectations. If we set the capacity curve too low, we exceed the job's termination time. Making sure that the performance expectations of workloads are met is achieved by the analytical pipelines. This is how the system of analytical pipelines used to produce load shaping guidelines is architectured. First, there is a component that collects carbon intensity data, both real-time and next-day forecasts. There is a component that learns the relationship between compute and power usage for each cluster across Google data center fleet. Then, there is a component that forecasts the next-day demand for different types of resources. And there is a component that classifies flexible computing jobs into different categories based on their spatial flexibility and estimates how much compute usage the system can shift within data center campus, region, continent, and between continents. Finally, there is a brain of our system, is an optimizer, which uses and inputs all the collected aggregate information to compute capacity curves for each cluster of the fleet. The linear program aims to compute a feasible distribution of flexible computing across Google clusters worldwide that minimizes the overall expected carbon footprint. The carbon footprint of a single cluster at a specific hour is computed as the product of its forecasted carbon intensity and expected power for that hour. The load shaping guidelines affect flexible compute workloads. To ensure that we do not break commitments to our users, we build the monitoring systems. When we detect that next day's demand is not met for some unpredicted reason, we stop the shaping, retrain the demand models, and restart the load shaping again. Next, let's zoom in into some components of the system. Forecasted in actual carbon intensity for each Google data center locations are obtained from the electricity maps. We partnered with this company early in the project for two reasons. They provide carbon intensity data for each grid where Google operates. And second, because they have sound published methodology for computing grid intensities. Power models are used to capture the relationship between compute and power of each data center cluster. We improved the power models from those used for planning before, where we discovered that piecewise linear model quite accurately predicts relationship between compute and power usage. The models change very slowly. They're retrained daily and used to estimate the impact from compute shifting on power and energy. Predicting spatial flexibility of compute workloads for next day comprises several steps, executed sequentially over the course of day. First, we identified the candidate jobs for spatial shifting. These are the jobs for which we know something about as they repeat, they're recurrent. Also, to make power shifting effective, if we want to shift jobs to consume more compute per unit of network bandwidth they require if moved away from their original location. So we sort jobs based on these criteria and then assign them into buckets or categories. From then on, we use the aggregate bucket usage to do accounting, and all jobs assigned to a bucket will end up with the same spatial flexibility range. Next, we forecast the next day's network availability at different levels of network hierarchy to understand how much computing we can shift. And now, it's time to assign flexibility range to each job bucket. Here, we run the mixed integer linear program that maximizes the expected amount of shifted computing subject to network availability. As a result of this optimization, buckets get assigned a specific range of flexibility, which can be a particular campus, region, continent, or cross-continental. Once this is done, we can provide an estimate of the amount of computing that we can shift within the specific spatial range next day, which we use to compute capacity curves. Also, each job that is a candidate for spatial shifting will have a list of feasible locations that will be used by a real-time placement system the next day. To summarize, learning the next day spatial flexibility can be split into two main steps, which happen one after the other. The first one conducts candidate job categorization into buckets based on the empirical distribution of jobs compute usage per unit of required network bandwidth. Just to give a notion of scale that we deal with, the system considers 2 billion jobs per day over 100-day history to capture the recurrent jobs and reduce the uncertainty of usage estimates. After the second step, assigns spatial range to each of the buckets so that network constraints, around thousands of them, are respected and the amount of potentially shifted computing is maximized. Once all the relevant information is generated, we compute the carbon-aware capacity curves for each Google cluster and hour of the next day, around 400 values per hour. The objective of the linear solver is to minimize the next day's expected carbon footprint, computed as the sum of carbon footprints for each cluster and hour of the day. To compute the capacity curves, we incorporate the relationship that our analytical pipelines compute, the relationship between compute and power usage, as well as the demand for computing and memory, two resources that are particularly constrained in our data centers. We capture the uncertainty in the next day's flexible demand, which we commit to meet on almost all days. The optimization also incorporates capacity constraints of different resources, cluster compute limits, memory limits, power limits, that cannot be exceeded. So what makes our approach effective at Google? First, the models predicting the next day demand and carbon intensities are accurate and depict the reality well. And this is uniformly the case for all clusters of Google Fleet. Next, the load shaping scales well. The planning layer is decoupled from the complexity of the real-time scheduling. It operates with aggregate demand estimates and easily scales as a data center fleet grows. The approach for computing capacity curves is easily extensible. It was quite straightforward to incorporate the new use cases over time. Importantly, the optimization is risk-aware. It incorporates explicit performance expectations for the managed workloads, prediction uncertainty, and capacity constraints. Looking back, we started scrappy. In 2019, we were testing the mechanism for temporal shifting. However, in 2020, we already deployed it at scale. From then on, the project got wider support and grew in scope. Soon after deploying temporal shifting, we started working with YouTube to find an effective way to shift their computing spatially. In 2020, we deployed campus-level spatial shifting and we started to support new use cases, grid-level demand response, and peak power shaving that you will hear about shortly. By 2023, the campus-level spatial shifting was deployed at scale. Going forward, by 2024, we already had a system that was shifting computing between data centers. And since then, we are working on building the methodologies for shifting other load segments such as high priority and AI workloads. Next, we will hear testimonials from our program director and Electricity Map COO, after which Adrian will talk about the project's impact.
I was the team's first program director, and I had the privilege of witnessing the impact the team had in developing and delivering carbon over computing. When the project first started, it really started as a 20% time project for a couple of individuals. You had a general notion of exploiting the workload flexibility in our compute jobs towards the end of reducing carbon emissions. As the idea and the project gained traction, they really made progress in a couple of areas. One, they developed models for better understanding short-term demand growth across different dimensions of power, network, carbon, and computing together. And they also developed optimization models to give our real-time schedulers information to move the workloads both in time and place to reduce carbon. And this allowed them to deliver carbon over computing, which shifts loads between data centers and delays loads in the time of day to the times and places and the hours when there's more wind and solar on the grid. And they really coined the term carbon over computing. This had never been done before. Over the years, the team has expanded its scope and influence to other areas. They provide carbon reporting to our cloud customers so that they themselves can optimize their carbon footprint and where they run their workloads. They've also made it easier to bin pack our data centers more fully so that we can build fewer data centers. And they've done a first integration of the grid to enable demand response programs with utility partners so we can shed load during the hours and days of the year when the grid is running at its peak capacity. Together, what they've done is really design and deliver carbon over computing to Google's customers, and the energy industry.
We started collaborating with Google researchers at the early stage of their carbon-aware computing platform development. And at the time, in 2018, we joined the collaboration because electricity was the only platform in which you could get global carbon intensity data in all the locations in which Google operated. This carbon-intelligent computing platform was really the launch of a first of its kind. It triggered a significant global transition because for the first time, it showed that it was indeed possible to move computations to the times and locations at which electricity was clean. It inspired many similar projects around the globe from large compute providers, but also smaller grassroots open source initiatives.
So as Anna said, on this project, I've taken the lead on quantifying the impact. I'd like to take you through those numbers now. Let's start with the original goal, carbon and energy. First, I'll show you what it looks like when compute load moves to greener locations or times. This plot is for a data center in my home country, the Netherlands. The top line, the green one, shows the gram CO2 per unit of compute, essentially the carbon intensity. The Netherlands has lots of solar power, so we see that carbon intensity is low when the sun is up, but higher in the evening and night when demand is met by fossil fuels. The bottom plot shows available compute capacity and actually utilized load for flexible compute. And what jumps out is this sawtooth pattern. There's more compute running at times when the carbon intensity is lower. Essentially, the data center runs harder when it's sunny. Conversely, when the sun goes down, we see the compute load drop as it avoids those dirty hours. This is temporal shifting. Now let's look at a data center in Finland. Electricity in Finland is very green, using mostly nuclear, wind, and hydro, so the carbon intensity is always low. In this data center, we see that the compute load fills all available capacity essentially all the time, making maximal use of this green electricity. This is an example of spatial shifting. Some compute jobs in the Netherlands' dirty times are moved to Finland to take advantage of the clean electricity there. Now, on the previous slide, we saw how that looked on a micro level by comparing two data centers. This is how it looks on a macro level across the largest data centers in our fleet. The bars show the net change in compute usage, energy consumption, and carbon footprint from our program's load shifting. First, notice that, from the plot on the left, there is no net change in total compute usage. The sum of the gray bars is 0. This reflects that we shift compute, but we don't change its total volume. However, notice that the sum of the green bars on the right, the carbon footprint, is not 0. There's more to the left of the y-axis than to the right, a net reduction. Essentially, we are shifting compute from data centers with a high carbon intensity, leading to a relatively large green bar to the left, to ones with a low carbon intensity, leading to a smaller green bar to the right. The sum of the bars across data centers is the program impact, and we can see a net reduction in both energy and carbon footprint. When running at full strength, we are saving around 75 gigawatt hours of electricity and 50,000 tons of carbon per year. Now, the last quantifier here, the 12%, is an interesting one. It says that by our load shifting, i.e. with no reduction in total work done, we reduce the carbon footprint from flexible compute around 12%, as much as we would have achieved if we had canceled all those jobs. And that's pretty cool. We achieve, just by moving jobs and without any hardware changes, about 1/8 of the reduction as canceling those workloads altogether. Now, one thing I loved about this project is that it also had lots of impact in areas we did not originally expect. I'll hand back to Anna, who has a great story about one of these related to the big Texas blackout back in 2021.
In Texas, where February is typically fairly warm, temperatures dipped dangerously low. And it came with a storm. More than 4 million Texans lost power. Many wouldn't get it back for nearly 5 days. By then, pipes had frozen, people were melting snow for drinking water, and dozens had died from the cold in their cars and in their homes.
The same storm in February 2021 spread to Oklahoma, where one of Google's largest data centers is located. I remember being called by our site reliability engineers to use our load shaping mechanism and reduce power over 2 days to help the local utility at this time of the increased demand for power. The mechanism managed to reduce 20 megawatts of data center usage, which is roughly the power of 20,000 homes. That was certainly one of the most meaningful moments of my professional career. After that, we used the mechanism to shed power consumption of Google's data centers in Europe during the energy crisis in 22 and 23. We built the load shedding product at scale in 23 and started supporting power utilities across the world during times of stress. The most recent recognition was received by Taiwan's grid operator for our services during their heat wave in the summer 24. Since then, Google's energy strategists have been using this feature of our system for negotiating additional power capacity for Google's growing data center fleet. Next, Adrian will talk about other additional benefits that our load management system made possible.
Thanks, Anna. Another powerful impact from this load shaping program comes from requiring fewer machines or a smaller electrical connection. In essence, data centers are designed for the peak demand. Our program allows us to first predict and then reduce peaks in compute usage. And this is where the impact becomes massive. This peak shaving avoids countless machines and reduces the required electrical connection by hundreds of megawatts. That's equivalent to cities the size of New Orleans. We're avoiding building whole new data centers. Finally, this program allows us to optimize resource usage. By looking at the whole fleet holistically, we can fill pockets of available resources in time and space, and also improve job performance. I'll let some of the senior executives at Google say more.
With great computing power comes great environmental responsibility. The development of a carbon-aware computing platform at Google is a stellar example of this tenet.
Before carbon-aware computing, Google and many other companies pledged climate commitments through carbon neutrality, where annual renewable energy purchases match the annual use of energy. However, we recognize that to better connect climate goals to real-world grids, renewable energy purchases and power-efficient operations are not enough. The true paradigm shift happened in 2020 with the Carbon-Aware Computing Project.
We developed a first-of-its-kind approach called Carbon Intelligent Compute, where we actually shift compute loads both in time and in location to align with the times of the days when the power grids are the cleanest.
This has had many benefits. One, it reduced our peak power by reliably shifting computing, allowing us to delay significant spending on new data centers. Two, it also significantly saved our data center energy usage and operating carbon emissions. And finally, we've also used this approach to increase the overall electricity grid infrastructure efficiency.
So for the last few years, we've actually leveraged this capability into data center demand response, which means that we can actually power down data centers at times when the grids are at their peak demand to help grid operators manage supply and demand better.
Our achievements were announced through years via Google keyword blog posts and by the tweets of our executives. And they are massively picked up by the world. Here are just a few ones. 1 year after the deployment of our system for temporal shifting, we organized the first workshop on carbon-aware computing to gather industry and academic leaders and share our approach to carbon-aware computing. Our goal was to create a community, share experience, and inspire others to scale carbon-aware computing solutions across the globe. We also published our research, power models, Google's approach to carbon-aware load shaping, and most recently, in partnership with external grid experts, we submitted a paper on the strategic grid-aware load shaping for the effective CO2 reduction. In the last couple of years, load flexibility is not only discussed in the context of CO2 reduction. Google strategy team partners with utilities, grid operators, and industry partners to exploit data center load flexibility to support grid reliability in exchange for more grid capacity. Our team continues to partner with the external grid expert team from electric power engineers to evaluate ways in which data center flexibility can support a reliable, affordable, and sustainable energy future. We finish our presentation with a statement from Hala Balouz, the president of Electric Power Engineers.
Hi, I'm Hala Balouz, founder, board chair, and chief vision officer of Electric Power Engineers. Data centers are not just large power consumers. They are reshaping the electric grid as we know it. And that demands a fundamentally different way of thinking. At Electric Power Engineers, we have been collaborating with Google's carbon-aware computing team since 2022, bringing together deep power systems modeling and operation expertise with advanced compute intelligence. We have demonstrated together something genuinely significant. Carbon-aware load shaping works. By intelligently shifting where compute load happens, data centers can influence generation dispatch on the grid, reducing system-wide CO2 emissions while maintaining reliability and affordability. In markets like ERCOT, our simulations showed that aligning compute with real-time grid signals can deliver meaningful emissions reductions. And when those strategies respond dynamically to real-time system conditions, the impact can be 2 to 3 times greater without increasing system cost. But here's what I find most compelling about this work. For the first time, we are demonstrating that load can actively participate in optimizing the grid. And that amplifies the significance of everything we are doing here.
Thank you.